Hello class, today I'm going to lecture on Chapter 16, Written Contracts. Under the Statute of Frauds, there are contracts that are required to be in writing, certain contracts, not all. According to the PowerPoint, many agreements are unenforceable unless they are in writing and signed or have some memorandum of it. These contracts that are required to be in writing are contracts for the interest in land, and we'll talk about what that means, contracts that cannot be performed within 1 year, contracts to pay the debt of another, contracts made by an executor of an estate, and contracts made in consideration of marriage, and contracts for the sale of good over $500. We'll talk about each of those and give examples. So, contracts that must be in writing. First, the agreement for an interest in land. A contract for an interest in land must be in writing in order to be enforceable, and that's the general rule. The exception to that rule is if there has been full performance by the seller on an agreement for the interest of land, and the second exception is if there's been part performance by the buyer. The buyer of land may be able to enforce an oral contract if she paid part of the price and either entered the land or made improvements to it. Another exception is promissory estoppel, which is if a promisor makes an oral promise that she reasonably caused the promisee to rely on it, the promisee does rely on it, the promisee may be able to enforce the promise. So those are three exceptions to the rule that says agreements for the interest of land must be in writing, and the three exceptions are full performance by the seller, part performance by the buyer, and promissory estoppel. Contracts that must be in writing. Agreements that cannot be performed within 1 year are unenforceable unless in writing. So these are examples of contracts that must be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. The promise to pay the debt of another, and look at page 396. When one person agrees to pay the debt of another as a favor to the debtor, it is called a collateral promise. If the promisor makes the guarantee out of self-interest, the statute of frauds doesn't apply. A promise made by an executor of an estate. An executor's promise to use their own funds to pay the debt of a deceased must be in writing to be enforceable, and a promise made in consideration of marriage is unenforceable unless it's a writing. And examples of those are prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements, and they're examples on page 396. So let's look at examples of what we've talked about so far, okay? So the first is on page 393, agreement for the interest in land. What is an agreement for the interest of land? Real estate, property, easements, those are interests in land. Those are examples of interests in land. So the general rule is a contract for the sale of any interest in land must be in writing to be enforceable, okay? Interest in land means any legal right regarding land. A house on a lot's an interest in land. A mortgage, an easement, a leased apartment, those are all interests in land. And as a general rule, leases must therefore be in writing. Although most states have created an exception for short-term leases, a short-term lease is often one for less than a year, although the length varies from state to state. So leases should be in writing. They must be in writing if they're for a year or more. So let's see. There's an example here on the page 393 about a lease that's required to be in writing. So Carrie Preston and Ken Saylor were roommates in a rental apartment in New Jersey that had a view of the Manhattan skyline. The lease was in Saylor's name, but the two split all expenses. The building became a cooperative, so the building went co-op, meaning that each tenant would have the option to buy the apartment. Saylor learned he could buy his unit for only $55,000 if he promptly paid a $1,000 fee to maintain his rights. He mentioned to Preston that he planned to buy the unit, and Preston asked if he could become half owner. Saylor agreed and borrowed the $1,000 from Preston to pay his initial fee. But as the time for closing on the purchase became nearer, Saylor realized he could not sell the apartment for a substantial profit. He placed an ad in the paper and promptly received a firm offer for $125,000. Saylor then told Preston that their deal was off and that he, Saylor, would be buying the unit alone. He did exactly that, and Preston filed a lawsuit. Regrettably, the outcome of Preston's suit was only too easy to predict. The co-op apartment is an interest in land, said the court. This agreement could be enforced only if it was put in writing and signed by Saylor. The parties had not put anything in writing, therefore Preston was out of luck. He was entitled to his $1,000 back, but nothing more. The apartment belonged to Saylor, who could live in it and sell it for a large, quick profit. Okay? There's also an example of how easements are an interest in land and need to be in writing at the bottom of 393. Suppose you're interested in buying 5 expensive acres in a fast-growing rural area. There is no water on the property, and the only way to bring public water to it is through land owned by a neighbor, Joanne, who agrees to sell an easement through her property. An easement is the legal right that an owner gives to another person to make some use of the land. In other words, Joanne will permit you to dig a 200-foot trench through her land and lay a water pipe there in exchange for $15,000. May you now safely purchase the 5 acres? Not until Joanne has signed the written easement. So you'll see examples of easements, like if there's a big house on a property and a small cottage behind. In order to access the cottage, you'd need an easement, which is permission to use the driveway to get to the back cottage, or the smaller property on a same parcel if there's no access to it. So an easement is permission to use that land to get to the land or the house you're going to. Okay. Let's look at a couple of other examples. There's an exam strategy on the top of 395, and this is an example of how a lease, not in writing, there's no lease. The lease is not in writing, so it cannot be enforceable. Let's see. Aditi and Danielle, MBA students, need an apartment for September. They find a lovely 2-bedroom unit that the owner is rehabbing. The students can see that the owner is honest. His workmanship is excellent. The owner agrees to rent them an apartment beginning September 1st for $1,200 a month for a year. He says, quote, "Come back at the end of August. By then my work will be done and I'll have the papers to sign." Adit asks, "Should we sign something now to be sure?" The landlord laughs and replies, "I trust you. Don't you trust me?" They both trust him, shake hands on the deal, and when the students return in August, the landlord has rented it to Danielle's former boyfriend for $1,400 a month. So they sue the landlord. Who do you think's gonna win? The landlord. An interest means any legal right. A lease is an interest in land, meaning that the students cannot enforce this agreement unless it's in writing, signed by the owner. And it's not. They had nothing in writing. The students need to look for a different apartment. Okay. An example of a contract. Let's see. Agreements that cannot be performed in 1 year. If you hire a band to play at your wedding 15 months from today, that agreement must be in writing. The gig may take only 1 single day, but that day will definitely not fall in the next 12 months. So the agreement must be in writing because it cannot be performed within 1 year. It's 15 months from now, so you need a contract in writing with the band to book the date. Got it? Okay, it's required to be in writing. Let's see. Promise made by an executor of an estate. Those promises are required to be in writing in order to be enforceable. We have on page 397 The promise made by an executor of an estate. An executor's promise to use her own funds to pay the debt of the deceased must be in writing in order to be enforced. Suppose Esmeralda dies penniless, owing Tina $35,000. Esmeralda's daughter Sapphire is the executor of her estate. Tina comes to Sapphire and demands her $35,000. Sapphire responds, "There is no money in Mama's estate, but don't worry, I'll make it up to you by paying you with my own money." Sapphire's oral promise is unenforceable. Tina should get it in writing when Sapphire's feeling more generous. Okay, and here's another example. This is a promise made in consideration of marriage. So what does that mean? We know elements of a contract: offer, acceptance, consideration, right? We know consideration is bargained for exchange. So if there is bargain for exchange for a marriage, that promise made in consideration of marriage needs to be in writing. So here's an example, once again at the bottom of 397. Let's see. Barney is a millionaire with the integrity of a gangster and the charm of a tax collector. He proposes to Lee, who promptly rejects him. Barney then pleads that if Lee will be his bride, he will give her an island he owns off the coast of California. Lee begins to see his good qualities and accepts. After they are married, Barney refuses to deliver the deed. Lee will get nothing from a court because a promise made in consideration of marriage must be in writing to be enforceable. And examples are prenuptial agreements, postnuptial agreements. Those need to be in writing in order to be enforceable. All right, what's this? Let's also look at the exam strategy on the bottom of page 399. It shows that an agreement must be signed by the party to be charged. Okay. Let's wait. The PowerPoint says what a writing must contain in order to be enforceable. The contract or memorandum must be signed by the defendant. That's the party to be charged. So that example is who the party to be charged is. But what the writing must contain in order to be enforceable. 1, the contract or memorandum must be signed by the defendant, the party to be charged, and it must state with reasonable certainty the name of each party, the subject matter of the agreement, and all of the essential terms and promises. Okay? So those are required elements in a writing in order for the writing to be enforceable. So, 399. Major retailer and owner negotiate a lease of a strip mall. The tendency to begin August 1st. Retailer's lawyer then drafted a lease accurately reflecting all terms agreed to, including the parties, the exact premises, the condition of the store, the dates of the lease, and the monthly rent of $18,000. Retailer signed the lease and delivered it to owner on July 4th. So the retailer signed the lease and delivered it to the owner on July 1st. On July 20th, owner leased the same space to a different tenant for $23,000 a month. Retailer sued, claiming that the parties had a binding deal and the owner had breached his agreement in order to obtain higher rent. And the question is, who would win? Okay, who do you think would win? The writing must be signed by the party claiming there is no contract. That is by the defendant. The owner was required to sign the lease in order to be held to it, and it doesn't say in that fact scenario that the owner signed the lease, okay? So the owner never signed the lease. This lease does not comply with the statute of frauds, and the retailer would lose in this case because it requires the party to be charged to have signed the lease. The defendant never signed it, so he can't be held to it. Okay? Great. All right. Electronic contracts, e-signatures are valid in all 50 states. Almost all states have adopted the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. So e-signatures are sufficient to prove a signature on a contract. Let's talk about the UCC statute of frauds for the sale of goods. UCC 2-201 section 1 states the basic rule is a contract for the sale of goods worth $500 or more needs to be in writing. A contract for the sale of goods worth $500 or more is not enforceable unless there's some writing signed by the defendant indicating the parties reached an agreement. So within a reasonable time of making an oral contract, if one merchant sends a written confirmation to another and the confirmation is definite to bind the sender, then the merchant who receives the confirmation will also be bound by it unless they object in writing within 10 days. So let's look at page 401. Okay, and that's at the top of page 401. A contract for the sale of goods of $500 or more is not enforceable unless there's some writing signed by the defendant indicating that the parties reached an agreement. So it needs some writing, which it can be distinguished from general contract law, right? The key difference between the common law rule and the UCC rule is that the code does not require all of the terms of the agreement to be in writing. The code looks for something simpler, an indication that the parties reached an agreement, only the quantity of the goods being sold. So let's look at an example of what that means. Suppose a short memorandum between textile dealers indicates the seller will sell to buyer grade AA 100% cotton white athletic socks. If the writing does not state the price, the parties can testify at court about what the market price was at the time of deal. If the writing says nothing about delivery date, the court will assume reasonable delivery date, say 60 days. But how many socks will be delivered? 100 pairs or 100,000? The court will have to have no objective evidence, and so the quantity must be written. All right, there's a little chart here of example of the results through the common law and the UCC. You can look at one versus the other in the text. Let's see, merchants exceptions. All right, let's go on. Parole evidence. What is parole evidence? So it's not jail, getting paroled from jail. Parole evidence under the civil law. Parole evidence refers to anything apart from the written contract itself that was said, done, or written before the parties signed the agreement or as they signed it. And that's on page 404. So the rule is when two parties make it a fully integrated contract, neither party may use parole evidence to contradict, vary, or add to the terms of a contract. Okay? So the signed written contract, which fully integrates all the terms, stands alone, and you cannot introduce other outside evidence, things that were said or other terms to contradict that contract. That's what the parole evidence rule says. Parole evidence is defined as anything apart from the written contract itself that was said, done, or written before they signed the contract or as they signed it. And once again, the rule is when two parties make an integrated contract, neither one may use that parole outside evidence to contradict, vary, or add to terms of the contract. Now, that's the general rule, and there are exceptions. The exception is if the contract had incomplete or ambiguous terms. So if a court determines that a written contract is incomplete or ambiguous, it will permit parole evidence, that outside evidence. And another exception is misrepresentation or duress. A court will permit permit parole evidence of misrepresentation or duress. Now let's look in the text. We're on page 404. Parole evidence refers to anything apart from the written contract that was said, done, or written before the parties signed the agreement or as they signed it. Another important term is integrated contract, which means a writing that the parties intended as a final, complete expression of their agreement. Okay. Let's see. That's the rule. So let's look at a case. There's actually, it's an interesting case on page 405. It's Mayo versus NC State University, and I want you to read this case because it's very interesting, and obviously it's close to home. But it involves a Mayo, who's a professor at NC State University in engineering, and he resigns from his position teaching at NC State. He gives notice, he resigns, and then after he leaves, the payroll department looks through his information in payroll, and they claim they overpaid him because even though he worked 9 months, he got paid over a 12-month period. So NC State said he was overpaid and they wanted their money back, okay, after he left. But Mayo said the contract didn't state anything about prepayment, and that was his full salary. It didn't say specifically that it was a prepayment, and the court said that that employment contract was fully integrated and no parole evidence was admissible to show that the contract could be contradicted by like the employee manual or the policy of the university. The contract was the final integration of the employment agreement, and he was entitled to keep that money. So the court said no parole evidence would be admissible to contradict that employment contract. Okay, so take a look at that. All right, that concludes chapter 16. Read chapter 16. You can listen to this lecture as many times as you like. Answer the questions at the back of the text chapter. Tune into our Zoom meeting on Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. or 5:30 p.m. and I'll go over some sample test questions. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about the material, and I'll be happy to review for the test that is due to be taken Sunday by 11:59 p.m. I've also uploaded additional videos that will reinforce the subject matter, maybe explain it a different way, maybe go more in depth, so you have that reinforcement of the material. Okay, thanks so much. Email me if you have any questions. Have a great day.